everyone, welcome to the nervous system. In this video we're going to describe the basic organization of the nervous system so we can get a handle on how all of the components relate to one another, and then in a series of many videos we'll describe in detail how the nervous system actually performs its functions. So the nervous system can be divided into two major components. One is the central nervous system, or CNS, which comprises the brain and the spinal cord. And then the other part is the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. And this is basically everything else. But what we really mean by that is the peripheral nerves, and then spinal nerves and cranial nerves. And so you'll see soon enough why it would be a little confusing and why we have to mention that it's spinal nerves and cranial nerves, but those really belong to the PNS. Now, the peripheral nervous system breaks down into two divisions, afferent and efferent. So they sound kind of similar, but they're distinctly different. The afferent division is responsible for sensory, delivery of sensory information to the central nervous system, and it breaks down into visceral and somatic sort of components. It's unofficial, but we can sort of think of it that way. And then the efferent division is the motor division, and it breaks down into two official nervous systems, the somatic nervous system, or SNS. So you can sort of match up the somatic from the efferent division and the somatic from the afferent division. And then the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, and that would be the visceral component, matching up to the visceral sensory. The autonomic nervous system divides further into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. You might know these because of the terms fight or flight, which relates to sympathetic, and rest and digest, which relates to parasympathetic. So those guys have antagonistic effects. So I know it's a brief overview, but really it's just sort of to get a handle on the different divisions, and we're going to go into each one of them in a lot of detail. So in order to have a good functional approach to the nervous system, I want to talk a little bit about the flow of communication that occurs throughout. So we start with sensory input. So it's going to be from all of our sensory receptors. And you can think of this as kind of a lot of things. I mean, things like taste and smell and vision are all examples of sensory input. But there's also examples of sensory input that are more, basal, the body's ability to recognize temperature and that sort of thing. And all this information is relayed to the central nervous system for integration. So sorting of information, making sure that it goes to the right spot, a specific area of the brain, and then the brain sort of turns it around and then will produce a motor output, some piece of information that will cause the body to react in a certain way, whether it be to move a muscle or to pull your hand away from a hot stove, any number of things that would be examples of a motor response to some sort of brain command. So I'd like to just draw a quick parallel to our earlier description of homeostasis, and the idea that homeostatic regulation occurs through the use of a receptor, a control center, and an effector. And we can sort of see how this would work. Sensory information is gathered up by receptors, and information is delivered to the control center. The control center offers commands, and the effectors, or the recipients of the commands, are able to then produce a desired response. So this is something, if you keep this in mind, it will be a little bit easier to understand all the things that are going to go on in terms of how the nervous system functions. So let's talk a little bit about the components of the nervous system on a cellular level. So the functional unit of the nervous system is the neuron. And so the neuron is basically a specialized type of cell that we're going to consider in another video. And the neuron works in conjunction with a variety of neuroglia. So neuroglia is a category of cells. So there are a bunch of different types of neuroglia. And we consider these cells the supporting cells, or we can also call them glial cells, or the glue that holds the nervous system together. All right, so now let's take a look at sort of another version of our flow of communication by inserting neurons into the picture. So this means of representing neurons will be common throughout our description. There'll be times where we have to draw the neuron with all of its detail, but there are many times where this kind of drawing will be enough to show the flow of communication. And what we're actually showing here is different functional classifications of neurons that exist in the different parts of the nervous system. First, let's consider sensory neurons. Sensory neurons deliver information from sensory receptors to the central nervous system, and they break down into two classifications, somatic and visceral. So earlier we mentioned that the afferent division could be subdivided into somatic and visceral, although not official. What we notice is that these different neurons have different ways of delivering sensory information. So somatic sensory neurons monitor the outside world and the body's position in that world. So any sort of sensory input that's going to come from external spaces is going to be traveling to the brain via somatic sensory neurons. And then visceral sensory neurons are monitoring internal conditions and the status of organs. So, for example, being able to sense abdominal pain could likely be an example of communications traveling via a visceral sensory neuron. So I just want to mention that a receptor is a sensory structure that detects changes in the internal environment or the presence of certain stimuli, and it allows for that information to then travel via the afferent neuron. So we could sort of use the words afferent and sensory synonymously because they're both, the afferent refers to the direction of flow to the CNS, but that's always going to be sensory, so we could kind of think of those together. Now, in the CNS, we're going to communicate with interneurons, and interneurons can be found in the brain and the spinal cord. They're responsible for distributing sensory information and coordinating motor activity. These neurons will communicate with motor neurons, and motor neurons are responsible for carrying instructions from the central nervous system to peripheral effectors. And the motor neurons also break down into somatic and visceral, just like sensory. And so somatic motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle. So you may recall that skeletal muscle is voluntary or under voluntary control. So these neurons will control voluntary contraction, as well as things like involuntary reflexes of the skeletal muscles. These neurons belong to the somatic nervous system. And then the visceral motor neurons innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and adipose tissue. And these neurons make up the autonomic nervous system. So remember that this information is coming from the central nervous system. It's traveling to the effectors via efferent neurons. So we could also sort of think of motor and efferent, those terms as being synonymous as well. So just to quickly summarize, we're going to draw the brain and the spinal cord and then draw some neurons sort of integrated with the brain and the spinal cord. We can see that we have a sensory neuron that travels from somewhere in the periphery to the spinal cord. It will communicate in the spinal cord with those interneurons in green, and the information can travel from the spinal cord up to the brain, and then information is appropriately distributed in the brain, and then the motor command that follows, we have the information coming from the brain to the spinal cord, and then utilizing motor neurons to communicate with the peripheral effectors. So it's going to take us a while to get through all of the happenings of the nervous system at the cellular level and then sort of on a more global scale. But I think that as long as you keep in mind this flow of communication, it will make it much easier to understand and to sort of keep track of what we're covering with regard to the nervous system. So that concludes our introduction to the nervous system. And now we're going to describe the different types of cells that we can find in the nervous system. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.